Hi, I'm Chris Ballard of the Australian National University, presenting a brief paper called Set in Stone, Chiefly Tidal Histories in Central Vanuatu. And I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri communities in Canberra. And I'd like to pay my respects both to their elders, past, present and future, as well as to the communities and chiefly councils of Tongawa and the Shepherd Islands, about whose histories I'll be speaking in this presentation, and to the Vanuatu Cultural Centre, Vanuatu National Library, and Vanuatu National Archives, who have hosted my research over many years. So these chiefly tidal histories relate to a small part of central Vanuatu, south central Vanuatu, in what is called the Shepherd Islands, group of islands to the north of Efate, where Port Vila is located, capital city. They're anomalous within the context of Vanuatu. They are the focus of exceptional oral traditions and genealogies, if you like, of title holders that go back 48 to 52 generations of title holders in depth. So quite extraordinary claims being made for history. They have canoe traditions, rather like Maori traditions in Aotearoa, detailing exactly who arrived on what canoe and where and who was on the canoe with them. What's interesting about these traditions is that about midway through these sequences, they also detail the eruption of Kuai, the island of Kuai, the former island of Kuai, creating the remnant islands of Epi and Tongawa, which you can see up in the north of that map. And that eruption is fairly securely dated to the middle of the 15th century. So that's about midway back through these claimed sequences of title holders recalled in oral histories. So I want to look at how these histories relate to stones in the landscape. And I'll do that by looking briefly at three kinds of stone, and the stories that relate to them. The first, Watani Manu, one particular rock, you can see it in the center of that map, Watani Manu, or Monument Rock near Mataso Island. The second being chiefly stones that relate directly to individual titles and their histories. And then the third, the way in which these stones have in a sense been reworked and rethought by Presbyterian missionaries from the late 19th century on, and then by the community again. So Watani Manu means Lord of the Birds. It's both a rock, which you can see in the photograph on the left, and a really widely known myth, the kind of myth that's told to and known by children across the region. And it's a myth about a stranger chief, a Wota, who comes by sea with his people, who are described as stones themselves, to the island of Efate. There he meets and marries a local woman, but he's reproached by his yam-growing father for being a lazy fisherman. And so he departs, and depending on where you are on Efate, moves either west or east around the island, calling out to his father-in-law, "Can you still see me?" And every time the father-in-law says yes, he uproots and moves on. And finally, he reaches the sea in the middle of the Shepherd Islands, and the father-in-law can no longer see him. He's far away enough, and he takes root as Monument Rock. And what's interesting about this kind of myth told to children is that in many respects it matches and simplifies the histories of arrival by canoe on Efate of this host of chiefly titles and their gradual ejection by local indigenous populations and their movement up to the Shepherd Islands, where they settle on what was then the island of Kuai. So there are oral traditions that relate to all of these individual chiefly titles, and there are thousands of them in the Shepherds. And they describe these migrations in stages, that arrival on Efate and the move up into the Shepherd Islands, and then the flight in the mid-15th century from the island of Kuai as it erupted. And they're seeking refuge in the southern Shepherd Islands and on Efate. And then they resettle Tongawa, kind of a whole second wave, if you like, of canoe myths. But they're woven together, these chiefly titles, in a kind of a regional hierarchical system that the anthropologist Jean Guillard described in the 1950s and 1960s, with most of the senior titles now back on that island of Tongoa, the eastern remnant of the island of Kauai. So if we look at Tongoa, it's a landscape, if you like, of chiefly stones. There are chiefly tidal stones in long, sinuous, snaky lines of little upright stones that mark the individual holders of particular senior titles. And this is one such line of title holders relating to a particular title. Then there are the grave markers, the larger upright stones that mark the burials of chiefs and some of their retainers and often their wives around them. There are stones as heirloom artifacts passed down through these senior chiefly families. And then there are magic and spirit stones scattered around the landscape, often apparently natural, but retaining particular powers, often that relate to the title that a chief holds, and therefore the chief has the power to provoke or invoke the power of that stone. So what's interesting in the 19th century is that the first Christian missionary to settle on Tongoa and to proselytize, the Norwegian Oscar Mikkelsen, who's there for over 40 years, quickly realizes how important both the chiefly histories and the stones are. And he, in a sense, puts those two together by commissioning these stelae, these monumental stones for chiefs who convert to Christianity. And on those stones, he engraves their deeds, their genealogies, and that then inspires a kind of a modern stone monument tradition on Tongoa, where chiefs are being recognized by their communities. So just in conclusion, just a few kind of summary thoughts about the role that stone plays in these chiefly histories. Stones are, at least initially, highly mobile, and the provenance of individual stones is critical to their power. So many of the chiefly stones arrive on those ocean-going canoes with particular chiefs and their titles. But when individuals die on Tongoa, former practice at least, the idea was that the grave marker stones would magically arrive on the beach at the time of their death, announcing their death. You would go down to the beach, find the appropriate stone, and that would then be the grave marker. There are also spirit stones that are on the land, like the one that we saw in the previous slide, that have links to stones that are in the sea or set into reefs. And these permit particular spirits to transform from being snakes or pigs on land to sharks on sea. And they can move through the archipelago, transforming alternately into sharks and pigs and moving along these regional networks of stones, if you like, stone pathways for spirits. Once they're set into the land, once they're emplaced, and often done so through ceremony where they're consecrated, stones then anchor places and people and stories. They become markers of things like boundaries, grave sites. They become markers of chiefly titled genealogies or the holders of those titles. And they become markers of Christian conversion and allegiance. But perhaps the most interesting thing is that these chiefly stones are themselves reservoirs of power. They've got agency that's independent of any individual title holder. And so the durable link is not between the stone and the human person, but between the stone and the chiefly title. And certain title holders simply fail to kind of match and wield the power either of the title or of the stone. Thank you very much.